Hi everyone, for today's video I thought I would turn Ranger's portrait here into a bit of a voiceover. When I first did this portrait I did upload to my YouTube channel a very quick 2 to 3 minute time lapse, but I thought this would be a nice one to add a little voiceover to. So this portrait was a considerably long portrait because it had a background and quite a difficult foreground, as you can see, with all that heather, all the individual flowers and the little pine needle leaves that went in between. So for this video for YouTube, I'm just going to focus on Ranger himself. So all going to plan, fingers crossed. My Patreon channel is going live on the 1st of February, so this Monday. So if you would like to see this portrait from start to finish, there is a 4-hour video over on my Patreon channel which will be available for you to watch as soon as you subscribe. I've been working hard to try and make sure that there is a library of content there for people who subscribe straight away to have access to, and Ranger's portrait will be one of them. Now I have said that my Patreon videos will be between 1 and 3 hours. This one was just over 4 hours. Now again, there will be content that's going to be at times over the 3 hours, which, you know, I didn't think people would mind for the same amount of money. But it's just because this had the background and the foreground, I didn't want to split this up into 2 parts, which is why it's going to take, you know, that slightly longer video. But as I say, that is over on my Patreon channel, which all goes to plan, is going to be live on Monday. Now in my Patreon videos, they are much slower, lots of real time. I will talk you through step by step exactly what I'm doing, the tips and techniques. There are no secrets. Everything I do for my portraits I explain, and you can see that because there are no elements of that section that I'm working on that have been cropped out at all. So it's everything from start to finish, depending on whether or not that's a focus video or a project like this, which is completely from start to finish. So on to Ranger here. Once I was happy that I got his eye in place and captured that really nice reflection, I applied my base layer with my soft tools and my soft pastel sticks. The way that I like to do this, and I go in depth with this in Patreon, is I have a bit of sandpaper to the side of me and I file down my soft pastel sticks to create a pile of pastel powder of each of those colours. I then apply that pigment, mix the colour that I want, apply that pigment to the paper with my soft tools. Now what I'm doing here is, once I've got my base layer down, I'm going over with my various pastel pencils. The brands that I use are the Carbothello, which is what I'm using here, the Pitt Pastels, the Derwent and the Caran as well. I have all of the light fast colours of the Pitt, Derwent and Carbothello, but I only have a select few of the Caran range. Now from my previous videos you may have listened to, the reason why I don't have all of the colours of that set is because they have these hard nuggets in. I don't like them, they make the pencils defective, and there are certain colours that seem to have this problem more so than others. So I do like to have the skin tones, the white. I've got a couple of the black, but I do prefer my Carbothello black because the black is definitely one of the colours that I've found that has these hard nuggets in. And I just won't buy the full set purely based on that reason. I've only got the few select colours that I like using, and that is mainly because they are so soft and they blend out really well. Again, but they do still have these hard nuggets in, so just bear that in mind if you are looking to try these pencils out. So I'm working on refining my base layers here, getting the general direction in which the fur travels, paying really close attention to your reference photo. That's really important. Now with Ranger, the photo that I had beautiful lighting. You can see from the finished portrait there on the left, the lighting was really strong, and because of his colouring being a blue Staffordshire Terrier, it was those blue colours, those grey colours really were reflective and bounced that light beautifully. Now if you are working on something like this which has got strong lighting, you want to make sure you capture that. Now I approached this portrait slightly differently with that in mind, in that I applied my lighter tones and reapplied my darker values on top with my pastel pencils rather than putting the dark base layer down first. Now again, this is explained in depth as why I did this over on my Patreon video, but I did not want to make the colour of the top of his head and the side of his muzzle too dark. I didn't want to go in with a harsh base layer. Although you can apply your lights on top, this area was so light, I wanted to put my light values on and work the opposite way round and put my darks on top of that. This is the really good thing about pastels, they're very versatile and they're very forgiving. So once you get confident with using your supplies, it is just a matter of finding the right balance and what works for you. Now, I like to work in small sections. It's definitely my preference. I find it's just the way that I can get a portrait completed sooner. I think I work faster and I work more effective. Now, that being said, if you much prefer to put your base layer down over the entire subject and work layer by layer over the entire subject, there is nothing wrong with that at all. But you would be following the videos in the same way. If you do like how I do the fur, you'd be following it in the same way, but just go back and forth in the videos to where I'm putting the base layers down, and then, like what I'm doing here, applying the more detailed layers on top. The one thing that you have to bear in mind when you are drawing any dog, especially a muscular breed like this, is you have to follow the fur direction really closely. The fur direction travels and changes direction for a reason. Now, that is because the structure of their face and the muscles on top of the bone structure will alter the fur direction. If you don't get this fur direction in the right direction or the right place, you are going to change that structure of that dog, and ultimately the finished portrait is not going to resemble that dog as well as it could do. Ears can be a tricky one to get your head around because they do have often a lot of shapes and a lot of tonal differences that don't actually make sense when you're drawing it. If that is the case, turn your artwork upside down and your brain will be forced to see the shapes rather than your brain thinking, this is an ear that I'm meant to be drawing, but it doesn't look like an ear. If you turn your artwork upside down, your brain will only see the abstract shapes. Then by the time you think you're finished and you turn your artwork and the reference photo back up the right way, you'll look at your reference photo and it will actually look more like that photo. And that's just purely because your brain processes what you're looking at slightly differently. If you are doing a subject of a similar colour to Ranger, there are a few pencils in the Derwent range that I would say are a must-have. The first is a graphite grey, and that is more of a bluer tint to it. The next is what I'm using here, which was the French grey, and that's got more of a purple tone to it. And then they also do a seal colour. Now, if you put that down on your paper, that looks very similar to black. It's not until you put the black next to it that you realise it's actually more of a very dark grey or a lighter version of black. But those three colours I used a lot on this portrait and they complement each other really well. So I always make sure I apply a lot of attention to my base layers. I think they are very important because they do map out your layers for you, ready for putting your details on top. Now, quite often I will use the soft tools or the eye makeup applicator tools to put my soft pastel on the paper. I will then go over the top with my pastel pencils to refine these layers. Now, that is something that I do because I'm trying to get more pigment on the paper before I go ahead and put my detailed layers on top. You don't want to fill the tooth of the paper too soon, which is why I apply my base layers in this way, just like what I'm doing here. Directly applying the soft pastel sticks to your paper or pan pastels runs the risk of filling the tooth of that paper. If you do struggle with getting your detailed layers with your pencils on top of these base layers, it's probably 99% the case that you filled the tooth of the paper too soon. If that does happen and you almost feel like your pencils are gliding over the base layers, it is often because you have filled the tooth of the paper. Now, I personally hate throwing artwork away because I think you learn from all these little mistakes and it's a learning process for sure. I personally would use a workable fixative over the top rather than throwing the artwork away. You can try and use a softer pencil which will try and grip as much of that pastel on top as you can, and that brand would be the Caran pencils. But as I say, they're not as easy to work with because they do have these little nuggets in at times. But the pencils that I've had, I would say at least 60% of them that I've tried have had these nuggets, so it is not just one or two pencils of that set. Now, bear in mind, if you do use a fixative, it is going to change the colour and the tone of your finished artwork. But with that in mind, you're not actually finished with your portrait anyway. You just want to get more tooth onto that paper, onto your base layers, so that you can then put your detailed layers on top with your pencils. So that's why I would go ahead and opt for a fixative, a workable fixative, rather than scrapping the portrait completely and starting again. Now, Ranger's nose had more of a bluer tone to it and there was an awful lot of detail to capture. So once I've got my base layers in, I'm going in with my white Pitt pastel pencil and my white Caran pencil, which is the brightest white because it's more softer, to get these highlights in place. Adding all this texture, it's all about putting your lights and darks in the right place. When you are drawing the nose, I always start off by blocking in the nostrils first, and that's because once you've got your nostrils in the correct place, you then know that you've got the main shape of the nose right. If you get these nostrils too narrow, too far apart, one higher than the other, if that's not the case in the reference photo, then ultimately the nose is not going to be right. If obviously, however, one of the nostrils is positioned slightly higher or lower, because that can happen, then obviously make sure you draw it that way, because that is how that dog is. But just make sure that if they are equal, that the placement and that, you know, how wide or narrow these nostrils are is accurate. When I am drawing any kind of muzzle area, like what I am doing here, I always map in where these dots are. Now these dots are where the whiskers are typically going to leave the skin, so they are important, and it's quite easy to put these in the wrong way. You don't want them sloping too much up towards the eye, and you don't want them too angled down towards the bottom lip. You will change the structure of the cheek here, so I always map in where these dots are first. So this was the only real part of the portrait that contained any real blue. When you look at this and you think, oh, it's a blue Staffordshire Bull Terrier, you may think that you do require using some blues, but that is not the case. The only reason why I'm using that on this area is because there is no fur, and it was just the skin, which is more reflective. It's got more of that shine to it. So it was just picking up a little bit more of the surrounding colour. The same would go with a yellow Labrador. You would think that you would have a lot of yellows in that coat, but that is almost never the case. So just pay really close attention to your colours. If colours are something that you are struggling with, I do have a video here on YouTube which explains how I pick my colours and the eyedropper tool, and how you can use that to help you pick out which colour you need for that set layer or that set detail. If that's of interest, then I'll put a card in the corner here, so have a look at that video if that is of use, if that is something that you are struggling with. So in my Patreon videos, I explain how using the pencil, the different sharpness in lead, how much pressure you put on that pencil, how you hold that pencil and how you rotate that pencil will create different fur strokes depending on the fur type that you are drawing. Because this is all explained during real-time clips or considerably slower clips, you can see exactly how I am moving that pencil and creating the fur strokes that you are after at that time. You will have certain subjects, long-haired dogs for instance, where the fur would be slightly longer and curlier. That would require a different way of using that pencil, as opposed to a breed such as Ranger here, which requires shorter fur strokes, which are tapered off at the beginning and the end to make sure you still create that softness despite the fact that it's shorter. You don't want any harsh stop and start lines when you're doing each individual fur stroke, so that is something that I do cover in depth and explain how you can create that depending on the fur type that we're working on with that project. Now for this muzzle area, this was more skin than fur, so you're only going to be drawing a few fur strands. There's not much here compared to the fur on the face. So you need to leave a lot of the base layers that you've worked hard to achieve showing through, because this part of the chin isn't actually furry. If you cover this in pencil strokes, you're going to make it appear as furry as his face section, which is not the case at all. You still want, in this case, for something like this with a shorter coat, especially Staffies, they do tend to have less hair on the chin and on the backs of their ears. You don't want to be drawing fur there if it isn't there, because obviously you're going to be making it look like he's got a fluffy chin when he may not. So when you're layering over your darker base layers, always use a darker grey to go over it first to indicate where the fur direction is. Don't just opt straight for your brighter values first, because you won't create as much depth in that darker section. There still needs to be as much detail in these areas, but it's going to be subtle and less noticeable. But when you look up close to that portrait, you'll still be able to see them. So that's why you need to be focusing on picking a pencil that's ever so slightly lighter than the black or the darker base that you've got, putting that in first, and then putting your lighter values on top. So working with multiple layers, but gradually building from dark to light with your pencils. If you are doing pet portraits and the collar is included, spend as much time on the collar as you have any other part of the portrait. Don't rush this section because it will show in the finished piece. When you are working and drawing on plastic or metal, the biggest thing to remember is it is all about your values, getting your lights in your right place and the darks in the right place. The lights need to be light enough and the darks need to be dark enough. That is more important over the colour, because if you do not have your values correct, the collar or any part of the portrait, fur, whatever it is you might be drawing, will appear flat. Now in this instance I decided to put this section of the collar in first because I knew that I potentially was going to be working with these base layers around it, so I wanted to make sure that I did not cover any of my sketch lines for the intricate parts of the collar. So I blocked in and mapped in the basic tones of this collar, and then I will go in and add the details on the collar once I've got this chest fur done. When you have a subject that is met up exactly with a foreground like what we've got here, make sure you bring that body and those tones right down to below where the foreground needs to be. The reason for that is it's better to have your subject background layers all the way down so that you can then build your foreground over the top of the subject, so that the foreground looks part of it rather than just stuck on the top of the subject, which is not what you want. If you had not brought this subject colour all the way down to the foreground, you potentially are going to end up with a halo type effect, and it's more noticeable that your foreground and your subject are not one. You want this to all flow and be complete, so just make sure you bring your subject background layers and base layers all the way down to your foreground. This will mean that, like when I go ahead and I add the flowers of the heather, I can overlap that onto my darker sections of the chest fur. It's far better to do it this way round because it then makes it look like that the flowers are overlapping the chest. And the good thing with pastels is it's very easy to put your lighter layers on top, even when you've got such a dark base as to what I've got here. But you'll often hear me in my videos talk about contrast and how your lighting is far more important than your colour, and I think this portrait explains that perfectly. Look at how light his face is and how dark his chest is. That is really important, and it makes this portrait that much more striking because I've got the values correct. More so than colour, I've made sure that my darks are as dark as they need to be and my lights are as light as they need to be. That is so important. Now the body part of Ranger here was sort of semi out of focus, so when I put my base layers down, I'm still going to be using my pastel pencils on top, but you will notice that they do not have a sharp point like what they did when I was working on the face. That is deliberate, and that is because the sharper your point on your pencil, the more detail you're going to be tempted to put in. Make your life easier and don't work with a sharper pencil when you're working on semi out of focus areas of your portrait. We all know that sharpening pencils is a right faff, and especially with pastels because sharpeners just blunt really quickly, so most of us use a blade to sharpen our pencils, and it does extend the process considerably. So you don't have to, when you're working on out of focus or semi out of focused areas, make sure that you use a semi blunt pencil and make that work for you. You will achieve that look of out of focus fur without any extra effort. So when I work on the metal of the tag here, I want to make sure that I've got my base layers of the fur in first. Now it's really important because what you don't want, if I was to draw the second part of the silver tag here at this moment in time, it wouldn't show up over the paper colour that I've chosen. Now the reason why I chose this paper colour was because it was working really well for Ranger's base colours anyway, especially on his face, being that it was the light grey. So I'm going to apply my base layers behind the silver part of the tag and then draw my metal on top of that so that I make sure I get it as crisp as I can and make it look part of this portrait. So you'll see on this collar I am mainly focusing on where those highlights are and where the shadows are. that is what's going to make it look like plastic, and it's very reflective. And this collar will obviously be cast in a shadow, which is why this section right below the collar is going to be darker. Now obviously, because this collar in relation to the size of his face is much smaller, you're not going to have the same amount of room to add all those fine details like what we have in the fur. That's absolutely fine and it's normal. So in this instance, just focus on your values rather than trying to cram a load of detail in which won't look realistic because it is a smaller area. One big tip, if you are struggling and trying to put too much detail in a small area, print out your reference photograph to the same size as your portrait. You will then be able to see that you can't physically see that detail. That then reassures you that you don't actually have to be trying to force in this detail because it's not necessary. So you can see here I didn't bring that shoulder background layer that I mentioned earlier far enough down. I brought that down a little bit further so that I could then overlap the foliage on top. In the reference photo, this heather and the flowers covered a good portion of the collar. Me and the client decided that if the collar was going to be included, it needed to be more on show. So we brought this heather down so that there was more of Ranger and the collar visible. It's things like this that you can make changes to your portrait and use a bit of artistic license to make your portrait better than the reference photo. When you come to near on completing your artwork and you think it's pretty much finished, a big tip that you can get in the habit of doing is take a photo on your phone and look at it on a smaller screen, because you do tend to notice the areas that you may need to tweak. When we've been sat at the easel for hours, days sometimes, you can not realise and notice the areas that may need to be tweaked and altered. Step back from it. I always like to put my portraits to the side for a day, go back to them and see whether or not, have fresh eyes, look at it and see if there's any alterations that are needed. But take a photo of it, and also if you adjust the contrast and you think that the photo on your phone looks better, go back to your artwork and adjust those values accordingly. If you think that artwork on the phone does look better, it's very easy with pastels to go and make those changes. Go and make your darks a bit darker and your lights a bit lighter. But photographing it on the phone and having a look at it on a screen is definitely one technique that you can use to make sure that there are not anything that you've missed on your portrait and that there's nothing that needs to be tweaked. So I hope this video was useful. Like I might say, if Patreon is of interest to you, don't hesitate to get in touch and I'll forward you some more information. But as I say, fingers crossed, it should all be launched and live and ready for you to access that content on the 1st of February. Thank you for watching. Bye!